After spending 5 days lying in a cold hospital bed, not a single one of my children came to visit me. In a moment of desperation, I called an old friend and poured out my heart for nearly 40 minutes, only to realize in shock that I had dialed the wrong number. 35 minutes later, an elegant woman walked into my hospital room with 5 bodyguards standing guard outside. She said, "I heard everything, and you need to know this truth today." And what she revealed next changed everything. I'm so thankful to have you here on Dad Returns. Let me know in the comments below, which city or country are you watching from? Also, please note, this narrative incorporates dramatic fictional elements for reflection and entertainment. Any resemblance to living people or specific places is purely coincidental, but the message shared today is deeply meaningful. The blue plastic chair beside my hospital bed had been empty for 5 days, not because no one knew I was there. Ethan knew. He had called on the second afternoon, 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I counted every one of them, because when you are 62 years old, with cardiac monitoring, leads taped across your chest, and nothing above you but a water-stained ceiling tile, you count things that used to not matter. He said he was sorry, said Claire was swamped with a client project, said he would try to get by when things settled down. He did not call again after that. Claire never called at all. I told myself it was fine. I had been telling myself things were fine for 3 years, ever since the January morning I came home from Brooklyn Methodist Hospital without Helen and stood in our kitchen looking at her reading glasses still folded on the counter beside the coffee maker, exactly where she always left them. A man learns which lies are load-bearing. He learns to stack them carefully the way you stack drywall against a wall that has no business holding weight, and he does not look too closely at the seams. But on the 5th night the seams gave. The man in the bed across from mine was named Frank DeLuca, 74 years old, retired longshoreman from Red Hook. The kind of man whose hands still looked like they could bend rebar, even now lying there in a hospital gown, with an IV in his left arm. His family arrived at 6:30 that evening, a son in paint-spattered work pants, who brought a foil-covered tray of lasagna, still warm enough to fog the plastic wrap, a daughter-in-law carrying a baby on her hip, 2 grandchildren who were told twice to stop running in the hallway before they actually stopped. Frank's wife, a small woman in a red cardigan, silver hair pinned back, pulled the blue plastic chair right up to his bedside and sat in it the way a person sits in a place they have earned the right to occupy. Frank reached out and took her hand without looking. Just reached out, and she was already there. I turned my face toward the window. Outside, the lights of the 59th Street Bridge strung themselves across the East River like a sentence I did not know how to finish. I looked at them until the laughter from Frank's side of the room became something I could hear without feeling it land. By 11:40, the family had gone. Frank was asleep, and the room settled into the particular quiet of a place where machines do the breathing and humans try to keep up. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with my heart rate, which was, according to the monitor, a perfectly unremarkable 58 beats per minute. I picked up my phone, scrolled to Thomas Reed. 31 years of friendship back to when we both worked the same commercial corridor in Flatbush, and he used to save me a parking spot on the street without being asked, because he knew I was always running 5 minutes late. If there was one person alive I could call at midnight and not have to explain the entire accumulated weight of a thing, it was Thomas. I pressed call. The line rang twice. Someone picked up. "Is Tom," I said, and my own voice came out rougher than I expected, the voice of a man who had not used it much in 5 days. "I know what time it is. I just need to talk to somebody for a little while, if that's all right." The line was quiet on the other end, but not empty. I could hear faint background noise, the low hum of a television maybe, or a window unit running somewhere. I kept going. 5 days, I said. "Lenox Hill Room 318, They've got me on cardiac monitoring because my rhythm keeps doing something. It's not supposed to do nothing critical, they say, but they want to watch it. Ethan called once. 3 minutes. I shifted against the pillow, and the lead wire taped below my collarbone pulled slightly. Claire didn't call. I keep looking at this chair next to my bed and thinking about how Helen used to sit in it every single time I was sick, every time without me having to ask. She'd bring that paperback she was always reading, but she never actually read it because she'd spend the whole time talking to me instead. My throat tightened around the next part, and I pressed through it anyway. It's her 38 years she sat in that chair, I said. And 3 years she's been gone, and I still pick up the phone to call her when something goes wrong. Isn't that something? I pressed my knuckles against my mouth for a moment, steadying. I'm not asking Ethan to move in and take care of me. I'm not asking him to put his life on hold. I'm asking him to sit in a chair for 20 minutes and ask me if I'm okay. That's the whole ask. 20 minutes. I talked for nearly 40 minutes. I talked about Helen's last year, about the way she held my hand in the hospital parking garage. The afternoon they confirmed the diagnosis and said, well, we've handled worse together, Richard, and we'll handle this the same way. I talked about Ethan growing up, how he used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching Giants games, how he cried at his mother's funeral with his whole body, the way children cry without any of the discipline adults learn to put over it. I talked until the words ran dry, and the monitor beside me beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm into the dark. Then a voice came through the phone. A woman's voice. Steady and measured, the voice of someone who had been listening with complete attention and had been waiting to know when it was her turn. Sir, she said, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think you may have reached the wrong number. The floor dropped out from under me. I pulled the phone from my ear and looked at the screen. The name there was not Thomas Reed. 1 digit off, 1 single digit, and for 38 minutes I had poured the most private corners of my life into the ear of a complete stranger. Heat flooded my face so fast it felt like a physical thing. I am so sorry, I said. My voice cracked down the middle on the last word. I didn't realize I thought I was calling my friend. I'll hang up right now. I'm sorry for bothering you. Wait. Her voice was quiet, but carried weight. What did you say your name was? I almost didn't answer. Something in the precision of how she asked, careful like a person handling something that might break, made me say it. Richard Hayes. The line went absolutely still. Then slowly each word placed down like something fragile. Richard Hayes. Were you ever a foreman on a construction site in Midtown Manhattan, around 1995? My hand locked around the phone. The monitor climbed 58, 62, 67. The name she had just reached into and pulled out of 30 years of my life sat in the room between us like something that had been waiting a long time to be said aloud. Who is this? I asked. Please don't leave the hospital, Mr. Hayes, she said. I'll be there in 35 minutes. The call ended. I sat holding the phone against my sternum, feeling my own heartbeat knock against my palm, and stared at the bridge lights reflected on the black surface of the East River below. 35 minutes. A wrong number that somehow knew a name I had not spoken aloud in years. Outside, a tug pushed north against the current, slow and certain, and I sat in the blue hospital light and thought a man dials the wrong number at midnight, and something he buried 30 years ago starts moving toward the surface. 34 minutes after the call ended, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the soft, rubber-soled shuffle of the night nursing staff making rounds. These were different, deliberate, measured, the footsteps of people who had decided exactly where they were going and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I counted at least 4 sets, maybe 5. Carol Simmons appeared in the doorway first. She was the charge nurse on my floor, a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s, who had checked my vitals every night, with the efficient calm of someone who had seen everything twice and stopped being surprised by most of it. But right now, her face carried something I had not seen from her before. A careful, apologetic expression, the look of a professional doing something outside her usual boundaries, and needing me to understand she had not chosen this lightly. Mr. Hayes, she said, keeping her voice low so Frank DeLuca would not stir. I know the hour. The hospital director called me directly. He gave personal authorization for this visit. There's a woman here who says she needs to see you. She paused. She gave her name to administration. The director recognized it immediately. Before I could respond, the woman stepped into the room. She was around 40 in a charcoal wool coat over a dark silk blouse, her black hair pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested she had dressed this carefully, even at midnight, and for a reason. Behind her, a younger woman in a gray blazer moved quickly to the wall beside the door and stood there without being told to. Through the open doorway, I could see 5 large men in dark jackets positioned along the hallway wall, evenly spaced, perfectly still, like load-bearing columns that had learned to breathe. The woman looked at me. Not the way people look at a patient with that careful, practiced distance that keeps the emotion from crossing over. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they have been trying to find for so long that actually finding it does not feel entirely real yet. Mr. Hayes, she said. Her voice was controlled. But underneath it, something vibrated the way a cable vibrates when the tension is almost more than it can hold. I heard everything you said tonight, and there is a truth you need to know before this night is over. She paused, one breath, deliberate and precise. My name is Elena Whitmore. My father was George Whitmore. The name did not hit me right away. Then it did. I need to sit down, I said. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Carol brought the blue plastic chair close to my bed, without being asked, the same chair that had been empty for 5 days, and Elena sat in it. She sat in it like it was exactly where she was supposed to be. I became aware that my palms were pressing flat against the mattress on either side of me, bracing the way you brace when the ground under a structure shifts without warning. Elena reached into the leather bag on her arm and placed a small wooden box on my bedside tray. Dark wood aged and smoothed the brass latch worn to the color of old honey. She opened it without ceremony. Inside, face up, was a photograph. A construction site. Midtown Manhattan, summer of 1995, from the light and the way the men in the frame were dressed. A young man in a hard hat and a canvas workshirt face carrying a thin layer of concrete dust, looking directly into the camera with the expression of someone who had just come through something and had not yet figured out how to name what it was. The young man was me, 30 years younger, 20 pounds lighter, with dark hair that had not yet learned the color it would eventually become. But unmistakably, completely me. My throat closed around a sound I did not make. "Turn it over," Elena said quietly. I picked it up. My fingers had developed a fine, involuntary trembling that started at the knuckles and moved inward toward my wrists. I flipped the photograph. On the back, in handwriting I did not recognize, blue ink, faded to the color of a bruise at the edges, but still perfectly clear. In the center, someone had written, "He went up when everyone else went down. Our family breathes because of this man." The trembling moved up through my arms and settled in my chest. I set the photograph down because I was no longer confident I could hold it level. "Your father," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, like something that had been kept in a drawer too long. "George Whitmore. He was on the 14th floor. Yes. The east stairwell had already started to go. I heard him shouting. I stared at the photograph on the tray at the man I used to be. I want you to know I almost didn't go back. I was already on the street. I stood there for a moment, and I almost kept walking. Elena's jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with happiness. But you didn't. I couldn't leave a man up there. My voice broke across the last word, and I pressed my lips together hard until it steadied. I pulled him out through the west corridor. We cleared the building maybe 30 seconds before the stairwell came down completely. I went back to work the following week. I never thought it needed following up. I just went back to work. My father spent over 20 years trying to find you, Elena said. Her hands folded in her lap were pressing against each other with visible force. The contractor's personnel records were lost when the company dissolved 2 years later. He hired 2 investigators. He never stopped. She stopped. Drew one careful breath. He passed away 7 years ago. He kept that photograph in his desk drawer until the last week of his life. He made me promise. Her voice caught once cleanly, and she pulled it back. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I would tell you that every good thing that happened to him after that summer happened because you went back up those stairs. I could not speak. My eyes burned, and I turned my face slightly toward the window so that Elena Whitmore would not watch a 62-year-old man come apart in a hospital bed over something that happened before she was fully grown. The bridge lights held their positions above the water, steady and indifferent the way certain things hold steady, regardless of what is happening beneath them. But Elena was not finished. She reached into her bag and removed a tablet. When she set it on the tray beside the photograph, her expression changed. The grief that had been close to the surface pulled back, replaced by something sharper and more deliberate, the look of a woman shifting from one kind of difficult conversation to another. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice dropping to a register that carried more weight than volume ever could. I did not come here only to thank you. On the screen was a document. At the top, in clean professional formatting, was a name I recognized immediately. Ethan James Hayes, and beside it, a number $2,400,000. The heart monitor beside me climbed 6 beats without asking my permission, and I sat in the blue light of that hospital room, holding a photograph of the man I used to be, staring at the name of the man I had raised, and understanding with a cold and absolute clarity that the wrong number I had dialed 40 minutes ago had just become the most consequential call of my life. I looked at the tablet screen for a long time without speaking. $2,400,000. The number sat there in clean black type against a white background, formatted in a spreadsheet column beside my son's full legal name, and it had the particular quality of something that refuses to be misread no matter how many times you try. Tell me, I said. Elena took the tablet and turned it so she could walk me through it. Camille Porter moved from her position by the door and stood at the foot of my bed, opening a slim leather portfolio across her forearm, organized, efficient, the movements of someone who had prepared for this conversation and intended to get through it without wasting either of our time. Over the past 14 months, Elena said, a man identifying himself as Ethan Hayes has approached 11 separate investors in the New York metropolitan area. In every case, he described his project as having the full backing of his father, Richard Hayes, 40 years in New York construction, and represented that Whitmore Foundation was in active discussions to become a strategic partner. She looked at me steadily. Neither of those things was true. I kept my voice level. How much has actually been transferred? $740,000 across 4 investors. The remaining amount represents commitments not yet funded. Elena set the tablet down. The investors who have already transferred funds believed they were putting money into a project with established credibility. Your credibility. They trusted the Hayes name because of what it represented in this industry. I looked at the ceiling. The same water stain I had been staring at for 5 days looked back at me, unchanged, indifferent. He used my name, I said. To people who know what my name means in this business. Yes. Camille turned a page in her portfolio and placed a printed document on my tray, a letter of intent from 8 months ago bearing Ethan's signature. In the second paragraph, the language was precise and deliberate. This project carries the full endorsement of Richard J. Hayes, whose 4-decade reputation in New York commercial construction serves as the foundational credibility of this investment opportunity. Additionally, Whitmore Foundation has expressed strong interest in a strategic partnership role. I read the paragraph twice. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure in my back teeth. He did not ask me, I said. Not one conversation, not one phone call about this. No, Elena said. He did not. I thought about the call on the second day. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. How are you feeling, Dad? Claire says hi. I'll try to get by when things settle. The easy warmth of it. The complete practiced ease of a man who had learned exactly how much warmth was required and deployed it with the precision of someone measuring a material. The investors, I said. Do they know I'm here? Do they know I'm alive and I never agreed to any of this? Some of them are beginning to ask questions, Elena said. Ethan has a presentation scheduled. 3 weeks from now, a hotel in Midtown. He's invited over 200 people. That event is when he intends to consolidate everything. New investors' existing commitments, the full public association of your name and mine with his project. She paused one beat. If that event happens the way he has planned it, the misrepresentation becomes significantly harder to unwind. The word misrepresentation had a specific meaning in what she was describing. When someone uses another person's name and reputation to solicit investments, presenting false endorsements, to induce people to part with money that crosses from bad judgment into fraud. I had spent 40 years in an industry built on contracts and liability. I understood exactly what Ethan had constructed, and I understood exactly how deliberately he had constructed it. There's one more thing, Elena said. Her voice shifted, not softer but more careful, the way a person gets careful when they are about to hand you something heavy. The reason he felt confident enough to do this, the reason he believed he had enough time. Camille placed a second document on my tray. A page of handwritten notes, not Ethan's handwriting, but organized clinical. A list of questions. Dates beside each one. I recognized the format. Hospital intake notes. During your first 2 days here, Elena said, before you were stable enough for regular visitors, a man identifying himself as your son visited the nursing station twice. He asked the attending staff about the cognitive effects of cardiac medication in patients your age. He asked about the legal threshold for determining whether a patient can execute financial documents. He asked whether prolonged stress in elderly patients could produce behavioral changes inconsistent with their baseline. The room felt suddenly smaller. He was building a file, I said. He was preparing the foundation for a guardianship argument, Elena said. Under New York law, any interested party can petition the court to appoint a guardian over another person's financial affairs if they can demonstrate that the person is incapacitated. The standard of proof is lower than most people assume. A cardiac hospitalization, some documentation of erratic behavior, a 47-second video clip of a man losing his temper that is enough to open a proceeding. And once a proceeding opens, your ability to sign documents to contradict claims made about your assets can be suspended for the duration of the review. I pressed both palms flat against the mattress. 40 years. 40 years I had pulled wire through conduit in buildings all over this city. Buildings that were still standing, that would be standing long after I was gone. I had taught every apprentice who ever handed me a tool that the most dangerous fault in any electrical system is not the one that trips the breaker. It is the one running quietly inside the wall-building heat, waiting for the moment when everything looks perfectly fine, and then is not. What Ethan had built was not impulsive. It was not a son making desperate choices under financial pressure. It was a system, designed with a specific failure point built in, designed around me. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "We confirmed the full picture 3 weeks ago," Elena said. "It took us another 2 weeks to find you." I nodded slowly. Outside the window, the bridge lights held their positions above the river, steady and untroubled. "At the chair beside my bed," I said. 5 days. "Yes," Elena said quietly. "We believed that was deliberate. A man who is isolated, exhausted, and feeling abandoned is considerably easier to pressure into signing documents than a man who has his family around him." I had been telling myself Ethan was busy. I had been counting 3 minutes and 47 seconds and calling it enough. I had been stacking load-bearing lies and not looking at the seams. The seams had been giving way for a long time. I just had not been standing close enough to hear it. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Elena looked at me with the steady, direct gaze of a woman who had crossed a city at midnight with 5 security personnel and a wooden box of her father's most important possessions, and said, "Right now, nothing. Tonight I just needed you to know." I did not sleep after Elena left. I lay in the dark with the wooden box on the tray beside me and the tablet screen gone black and my mind running the same loop a faulty circuit runs when the path is broken, searching for a connection that is no longer where it is supposed to be. At some point, Frank DeLuca began snoring across the room, a low and steady sound that under different circumstances might have been irritating. Tonight, it was the only thing in the room that felt honest. At 6:53 in the morning, I picked up my phone and looked at the screen before I dialed. Thomas Reed. I pressed call. He answered on the second ring, already alert, his voice carrying the particular wakefulness of a man who had spent 30 years in commercial contracting and never fully stopped listening for things that did not sound right. Thomas was 64 years old, built like a former linebacker, gone slightly soft at the edges, with a face that had the quality of a good structural beam, not pretty, but exactly as strong as it needed to be. We had been friends since 1994, when we worked adjacent jobs on the same block in Flatbush, and discovered we both took our coffee the same way, and had the same opinion about contractors who cut corners on electrical. "Richard," his voice was careful, "you're calling early. I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." "Go ahead." I told him everything. The wrong number. Elena Whitmore. The photograph. George Whitmore and the summer of 1995. The tablet. The 14 months of investors. The $2,400,000. The letter of intent with my name in the second paragraph. The nursing station notes with Ethan's questions about cognitive capacity and financial competency. By the time I finished, the morning light had gone from gray to pale yellow through the window, and Carol Simmons had come in once to check my monitor without saying anything. Thomas was quiet for 4 full seconds. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say. The silence of a man sorting what he intends to say into the correct order. "Don't let Ethan know we're looking at him," Thomas said. Not a word. Not a change in how you answer his calls. Can you do that? I've been doing it for years without knowing it, I said. I'm better at it than I realized. I'll be there by 9. He arrived at 8:57 carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cart on First Avenue and a spiral notebook he set on my tray without opening. He pulled the blue plastic chair close and dropped into it with the ease of a man sitting down somewhere he had sat 100 times before, and something about seeing that chair occupied by Thomas, specifically, after 5 days of looking at it empty, made the tightness in my chest ease by one small degree. Before anything else, he said, pushing one of the cups toward me. How are you actually doing? I'm functional, I said. He looked at me over his cup with the flat, patient expression he used when he thought I was giving him the short answer instead of the true one. I'm not fine, I said. But I know what the problem is now. That's different from not knowing. I can work with a problem I can see. Thomas nodded and opened the notebook. We had been talking for 40 minutes when my phone rang. I looked at the screen and held it up so Thomas could see the name. Ethan Hayes. Thomas gave one short nod. I pressed accept. Hey, son. Dad. His voice was warm and unhurt, the voice of a man who had slept well and eaten breakfast and had no particular reason to feel anything other than fine. I've been thinking about you. How are you feeling? The doctor's treating you okay over there? Better every day, I said. Rhythm's been more stable. They say maybe another day or two and I can go home. That's great, Dad. That's really great. A pause exactly the right length, long enough to suggest genuine relief, short enough to suggest a man with a full schedule. Listen, I'm sorry I haven't been able to get over there. Things have been moving fast with the business. Claire's been asking about you, too. Tell her I appreciate it, I said. You need anything, I can have food sent over, whatever you want. I'm all right. The food here isn't bad. Okay, good. Another pause. I'll try to get by before you're discharged if the timing works out. I really will try, Dad. I know you will, I said. Don't stress about it. Focus on your work. The call ended. I set the phone face down on the tray. Thomas had not moved. He was watching me with the steady, evaluating gaze of a man who had just watched someone do something difficult and was deciding how much to say about it. 30 seconds, he said. You sounded completely normal for the entire 30 seconds. He sounded completely normal too, I said. That's the part that stays with me. Thomas picked up his pen and wrote something in the notebook. Then he tore the page out and slid it across to me. On it, he had written 3 things: investor list, letter of intent, origin, nursing station visits. I'm going to start with the investors, he said. I want to talk to the ones who transferred money first. Find out exactly what they were told, exactly when, exactly how Ethan represented your involvement. He tapped the second item. Then I want to find out who helped him draft that letter. That language did not come from Ethan alone. Someone coached him on how to write a misrepresentation that sounds like a legitimate endorsement. And the nursing station, I said. Carol Simmons, Thomas said. She left you those notes for a reason. I want to talk to her directly. As if she had heard her name, Carol appeared in the doorway at that moment, not for rounds, not for vitals. She stood in the doorframe with her hands at her sides and looked at me with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was standing behind it. Mr. Hayes, she said. There's something else I should have included in those notes. She stepped into the room, lowered her voice. The second time your son came to the nursing station. When he left, I walked him to the elevator. He made a phone call in the hallway. I only heard one sentence before the doors closed. She looked at me directly. He said she just needs to keep him calm and cooperative until I have everything in position. The morning light lay flat and cold across my tray. Thomas wrote the sentence down in his notebook, word for word, and underlined it twice. Thomas left the hospital at 11:15 and came back at 4:10 with a notebook that was considerably fuller than when he had walked out with it. He did not sit down right away. He stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me with the expression he used when the information he was carrying was heavier than he had expected it to be when he picked it up, and he needed a moment to decide how to set it down without dropping it. "I'm going to tell you a few things," he said, "and I need you to hear all of them before you respond to any of them." "Go ahead." He pulled the chair close and opened the notebook. "Shaikaita, I went to see Marcus Webb first. He runs a small private equity group out of an office on Lexington mid-50s. Careful the kind of man who does his homework before he writes a check. Ethan approached him 14 months ago at a networking event in Midtown. Webb told me Ethan spent 45 minutes describing the project, and in that 45 minutes, he mentioned your name 11 times. Webb counted. He remembered because he thought it was unusual. Most people mention their references once, maybe twice. Ethan mentioned you 11 times, like he was building something with repetition. Thomas tapped his pen on the notebook. Webb said he nearly wrote the check on the spot. He held back only because he wanted to verify one thing. First, he wanted to call you directly and confirm you were involved. "He never called me," I said. "He tried. 3 times over 2 weeks. The calls went to voicemail. He left messages." Thomas looked at me steadily. "You never got them." I sat with that for a moment. "My voicemail," I said. "I think someone changed your notification settings, possibly earlier. I want to check your phone before you leave this hospital." Thomas wrote something and moved to the next page. Webb eventually decided to hold his investment pending further verification. 2 of the people he referred to Ethan were not as cautious. They transferred funds within 30 days of their first meeting with Ethan. Before I could respond, a knock came at the open door. Dr. Alan Marsh stepped in, my attending physician. A compact man in his early 50s, with steel-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered enough difficult information to understand that speed does not soften it. He had been the one managing my cardiac monitoring all week, and he had treated me with the particular professional warmth of a doctor who respects that a patient is also a person. He looked at Thomas, then at me. I was going to wait until tomorrow. Dr. Marsh said, "But I think you should hear this today." He stepped further into the room and kept his voice measured. "Your son came to speak with me twice during your first 3 days here. The first visit, he asked reasonable questions. Your medication, your expected discharge timeline, whether the arrhythmia posed any long-term limitations. I answered those without concern." He paused. The second visit was different. He asked me whether cardiac patients your age commonly experienced episodes of confusion or impaired judgment. He asked whether stress could cause a man of your profile to behave in ways inconsistent with his normal character. He asked whether I would document any such episodes if I observed them. The room was very still. I told him I would document whatever was clinically relevant. Dr. Marsh continued, and that I was not in a position to provide assessments for non-medical purposes. He thanked me and left. The doctor looked at me directly. "I should have mentioned this sooner. I am mentioning it now." "Thank you," I said. "I mean that." Dr. Marsh gave a single nod and left the room. Thomas had been writing the entire time. He finished his note, looked up, and said, "He is building a paper trail, establishing a pattern, erratic behavior, cognitive questions, a man under cardiac stress whose judgment may be compromised." That paper trail is the foundation for a guardianship petition. Elena explained the mechanism last night, I said. Then you understand what the timeline means. 3 weeks until his Midtown event. If he files the guardianship petition before that event, you cannot contradict him publicly. You cannot sign a new will. You cannot revoke anything Claire helped him put in place. You are for all practical purposes frozen. Thomas set his pen down. He needs you frozen for long enough. I looked at the window. The afternoon light on the East River was the flat silver of old pewter, the kind of sky that cannot decide whether it wants to snow. There is one more thing, Thomas said. He reached into his coat pocket and placed his phone on my tray screen facing up. On it was a photograph of a phone screen, a contacts list, clearly someone else's device. At the top of the recent calls column was a number I recognized as my own. The name it was saved under was not Dad. It was not Father. It was not even Richard. It read Old Man. Below the name, a call log. 14 incoming calls from my number over the past 6 weeks. Every single one marked with a red declined arrow. I was at Webb's office this morning, Thomas said. Ethan came in unexpectedly to pick something up. He left his phone on the conference table when he stepped out to speak to someone in the hallway. The screen was already on. Thomas's voice was even and careful the way it got when he was being precise about something that mattered. I saw your number light up on his screen. I saw the name he had saved it under. I photographed it before the screen went dark. I looked at the image on Thomas's phone for a long time. 14 calls. 14 red arrows. My number. My voice. My attempts to reach my son across 6 weeks of ordinary time, reduced to a contact label that 2 syllables long and colder than anything I had felt in that hospital room all week. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. Something happened that was quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The last version of a story I had been telling myself about my son simply stopped being available to tell. He changed, I said. Not a question, not an accusation. Just a fact I was placing down on a surface where I could look at it clearly. People do, Thomas said. He did not try to make it better than that. I picked up Thomas's phone and looked at the contact name one more time. Then I set it down and looked at the ceiling and breathed in and out 4 times in the careful, measured way Dr. Marsh had shown me during my first night here. The technique for bringing an irregular rhythm back toward something the body can sustain. Thomas, I said, when you go back out this evening, I need you to find out one more thing. Name it. That sentence Carol heard Ethan say. She just needs to keep him calm and cooperative. Find out who she is. Thomas picked up his pen. I think I already know, he said. But I'll confirm it. Thomas arrived at 7:45 in the morning, wearing the same shirt he had worn the day before, which told me everything I needed to know about how he had spent the night. He set a paper coffee cup on my tray, kept one for himself, and pulled the blue plastic chair close without a word. He looked like a man who had been moving through information for hours and had finally arrived at the part he needed to deliver in person. Her name keeps coming up, he said. Every time I pull a thread, it leads back to Claire. He opened the notebook to a page dense with handwriting and began. Thomas had spent the previous evening making calls, 3 investors, 2 of Ethan's former business contacts, and a woman named Patricia Hollis, who had worked as an office manager for Ethan's company for 8 months before resigning last spring. Patricia had agreed to talk, and she had talked at length. Patricia told me that Claire came into the office regularly, Thomas said. Not occasionally regularly, 2-3 times a week. She sat in on meetings she had no formal role in. She reviewed contracts before Ethan signed them. She was the one who suggested the approach of using your name and the Whitmore connection. Patricia heard her say it directly in a meeting with Ethan and two others 14 months ago. Thomas looked up at me. Claire said the Hayes name is worth more than anything we can build from scratch in the next 5 years. We use it now while we still have access to it. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the tray. While we still have access to it. She was not talking about a business strategy, I said. She was talking about a countdown. Yes, Thomas said. That is exactly what she was talking about. He turned 2 pages and laid the notebook flat, so I could see what he had drawn, a timeline, dates running left to right across the page, events marked above and below the line. Above, dates when Claire had been particularly attentive toward me. Visits with food, offers to help with paperwork. The afternoon she drove me to my cardiologist appointment and waited in the lobby for 2 hours, reading a magazine, asking nothing in return. Below each of those dates, Thomas had written what followed within days or weeks. August of 2023. Claire cooked chicken soup and brought it to the house when I had a bad cold. 11 days later, I signed a loan guarantee for $80,000 for Ethan's company. I had felt at the time that it was the reasonable thing to do for a son who was building something. I had not connected it to the soup. November of 2023. Claire called and suggested we go shopping together for a winter said she wanted to spend time with me, said she missed having family around since Helen passed. We spent an afternoon on Atlantic Avenue. 2 days later, Ethan called with an urgent request for $50,000 from my savings account to cover what he described as a time-sensitive operational expense. I had wired the money that same afternoon. March of 2024. Claire called again. Said she wanted to help me get my paperwork organized. Said it had been on her mind. Said Helen would have wanted things to be tidy and clear in case anything ever happened. She brought a friend to help with the documents. A woman I had never met. I had signed where they showed me to sign because Claire was sitting across the table from me, and Helen's name was in the room, and it had seemed like the kind of thing a responsible man does. I looked at the timeline on the notebook page for a long time. 40 years I had read wiring diagrams in buildings all over this city. 40 years of tracing current through systems, finding where the load was being drawn, identifying which connections were carrying more than they were designed to carry. The skill was not complicated. You followed the path. You looked at where the energy was going. You asked who benefited when the circuit completed. I had never once applied that skill to my own kitchen table. She planned the timing, I said. Every kindness had a function. Every single one that I can document, Thomas said. There may be others I haven't found yet. I thought about the afternoon on Atlantic Avenue. Claire had laughed at something I said about a hat in a shop window, a genuine laugh, or what I had taken for one. I had driven home afterward, thinking that perhaps I had misjudged her, that perhaps she was simply a woman who showed affection in practical ways the way some people do. I had felt for a few hours that evening less alone in the house. I had been a component in a circuit. I had not known I was in one. The woman she brought to help with the documents in March, I said. Who was she? Thomas turned to the last page of his notes. Jennifer Lowe, 34 years old, lives in Park Slope. She is a bookkeeper, not an attorney. She is not licensed to prepare legal documents. He looked at me. But she prepared yours. My jaw tightened until the pressure traveled up through my back teeth and into my temples. Claire told her it was a routine update. Thomas continued. Told her the language had already been reviewed. She just needed someone to format it properly and witness the signing. Jennifer said she understood it to be a simple administrative task. A pause. She did not understand what the clause about temporary transfer of financial authority actually meant. She told me last night she has been losing sleep over it since she found out. How did she find out? Elena's attorney flagged it 2 days ago when reviewing your existing documents. Jennifer received a call asking her to explain her role. She has agreed to provide a full written account. Thomas closed the notebook. Richard, the document Claire had you sign is not legally airtight. A bookkeeper with no legal license prepared it. The language is ambiguous, and there is documented evidence of misrepresentation in how it was presented to you. Elena's attorney believes it can be challenged and voided. I looked at the window. The morning light was thin and white, the kind of February light that gives nothing warmth. She sat across from me at that table, I said. Helen's table. She used Helen's name to get me to sign something that was designed to take everything Helen and I spent 40 years building. I stopped, and I thanked her for being thoughtful. Thomas did not try to reframe it. He did not offer a softer version of what I had just said. He looked at me steadily and said, yes, that is what happened. Outside, a siren moved up First Avenue and faded north, and the room settled back into its quiet. And I sat with the full weight of what I now understood about the woman my son had married, and the patience with which she had built her strategy inside my trust. Tonight, I said, I want to go home and look at my own house. Dr. Marsh signed my discharge papers at 6 in the evening, which was earlier than planned and later than I wanted. He went through the standard instructions, the medications, the follow-up appointment, the things to avoid in the first 2 weeks. He shook my hand at the door of the room and looked at me with the direct, unhurried gaze he used when he wanted to make sure he was actually heard. Mr. Hayes, he said, whatever is happening outside this hospital, take care of the man inside it first. I told him I would try. He looked like he believed me about 60% of the way. Thomas drove me home. We did not talk much on the way. The BQE was slow with evening traffic. Brake lights stretching back toward the tunnel, in a red chain, the East River black and cold to our left. Thomas kept both hands on the wheel and let the silence sit between us without trying to fill it, which was one of the things I had always valued most about him. His understanding that some silences were doing necessary work and should not be interrupted. We turned onto my block at 7:23. The house looked the same from the outside. Same white aluminum siding, same black shutters Helen had insisted on, because she said they gave the place character, same front walk, with the crack along the left edge that I had been meaning to patch for 2 years. The maple tree in the front yard had lost its leaves months ago and stood bare against the February sky, its branches making the same pattern against the dark they had always made. I put my key in the front door and opened it. The hallway was wrong immediately. Not dramatically wrong, not ransacked, not destroyed. Wrong in the way a room is wrong when something essential has been removed, and the space has not yet learned to close around the absence. The coat rack was still there. The small table where Helen used to leave her keys was still there. But the framed photograph that had hung on the hallway wall for 22 years, Helen and me on the Cape the summer Ethan turned 12, both of us squinting into the sun and laughing at something neither of us could remember, afterward was gone. The nail was still in the wall. The faint rectangle of slightly less faded paint showed exactly where the frame had been. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked into the living room. The dining table was gone, not moved to another room. Gone. The space where it had stood for 19 years was empty floor, and in the carpet I could see the 4 shallow impressions where the legs had rested so long they had pressed themselves permanently into the fibers. Helen had chosen that table at a furniture store on Flatbush Avenue the spring after we moved in. She had walked around it 3 times before deciding. She had said it was the right size for the family she intended to have in this house. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the 4 marks in the carpet. Thomas stood behind me and did not say anything. I walked to the bookshelf in the corner. Helen's bookshelf, the one she had organized by subject and then reorganized by color, and then reorganized again by the order in which she had read the books, a system that made sense only to her and that I had never once touched, because it was hers. The shelves were empty. Not dusty empty the way shelves look when books have been gone a long time. Clean empty, recently empty, the kind of empty that still has the faint smell of the things that used to be there. I reached out and touched the middle shelf with 2 fingers. "Richard." Thomas's voice was quiet behind me. "I know," I said. I did not turn around. I checked the kitchen next. The baking dishes Helen had inherited from her mother were gone from the cabinet above the refrigerator. The ceramic rooster she had bought at a market in Vermont on our 25th anniversary, gone from the windowsill above the sink, where it had stood for 17 years. The small things. The things that had no resale value. The things someone takes when they are not stealing but erasing. I went back to the living room and sat down on the couch and put my hands on my knees. Thomas sat beside me. Not across from me, beside me, close enough that his shoulder was nearly touching mine, and I understood that this was a deliberate choice, and was grateful for it without being able to say so. "She did this while I was in the hospital," I said. "Yes. She took Helen's books, Helen's dishes." I stopped, started again. There was a photograph of Helen and me in the hallway, 22 years on that wall. Thomas nodded. "She took that too." We sat for a moment. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, and the room went dark again. "There is a woman across the street you need to talk to," Thomas said. "Her name is Dorothy Mills. She has lived there for 22 years. She saw the truck." I looked at him. "She called me this afternoon while you were getting discharged," Thomas said. "She was hesitant. She said she did not want to cause trouble. I told her the trouble was already here, and she was not the one who brought it." He paused. "She is home right now. She said she would wait up." I stood up from the couch. My legs were steadier than I expected them to be. Dorothy Mills answered her door before I had finished knocking, a small woman in a blue cardigan, white hair, cut short eyes that were sharp and apologetic in equal measure. She held the door open and said, "Richard, I am so sorry I did not call sooner." And her voice cracked across the middle of the sentence in a way that told me she had been carrying this for days, and the weight of it had been considerable. "Tell me what you saw," I said. She had seen a dark SUV arrive on the 2nd day of my hospitalization. Claire had come with 2 men she did not recognize. They had been inside for nearly 3 hours. The dining table had come out first, carried between the 2 men, while Claire held the front door. Then boxes. Then the bookshelf contents in garbage bags, which Dorothy said had struck her as wrong, books in garbage bags. But she had told herself there must be an explanation. "She came back alone on the 4th day," Dorothy said. Her hands were twisting together in her lap. "She was only inside for maybe 30 minutes. She carried 1 box out herself." Dorothy looked at me directly. "Richard, I heard her on the phone outside before she went in. I was not trying to listen. My window was open." She stopped. She said, "He will not know until everything is already done." I stood on Dorothy's front porch in the February cold and looked across the street at my house, at the lit windows at the front walk, with the crack along the left edge at the bare maple tree. Helen had planted that tree the first spring we lived there. She had carried it home from a nursery in the back of our station wagon, wrapped in burlap, the root ball wedged between our feet, because it would not fit in the trunk. She had said a yard needed something that would outlast both of them. The tree was still there. Everything else was negotiable. Thomas offered to stay. I told him to go home and sleep because one of us should, and he looked at me with the flat expression that meant he knew I was sending him away for my own reasons and not his comfort. But he went anyway, because 31 years of friendship had taught him when to push and when to let a man have the room he was asking for. I locked the front door and stood in the hallway. The house made the sounds old houses make at night. The settling of wood, the tick of the baseboard heat, cycling on the particular creak from the third stair that Helen used to say was the house clearing its throat. I had lived inside these sounds for 26 years, and they had always been ordinary. Tonight, they were the only things in the building that had not been touched. I did not go back into the living room. I did not look again at the 4 impressions in the carpet where the dining table had stood. I walked down the hallway to the bedroom, turned on the lamp on my side of the bed. Helen's lamp, the one with the cream shade she had bought at an estate sale in Park Slope 15 years ago, and declared was exactly right, and I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Claire had taken the bookshelf. She had taken the dishes. She had taken the photograph from the hallway and the ceramic rooster from the kitchen windowsill. But she had not opened this drawer because she did not know this drawer existed in the way it existed as anything other than a place where a man kept his reading glasses and his spare phone charger and the things he did not want to explain to anyone. The wooden box was still there. Helen had bought it at a flea market in Red Hook the summer of 1998. She had paid $7 for it and carried it home wrapped in her cardigan because it had started to rain and she did not want the wood to warp. She said she intended to use it for important things, by which she meant things that mattered more than their size suggested. I lifted it out and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The small ring that had belonged to Helen's grandmother, a thin gold band with a chip of garnet, modest and worn smooth. 3 folded notes in Helen's handwriting, things she had written to herself over the years, reminders of things she wanted to remember. And at the bottom, folded into quarters, a document I recognized by the texture of the paper before I had even opened it. The particular weight of the yellow legal pad pages I had always used for drafts. 3 pages. My own handwriting younger and slightly more hurried than it was now, the ink faded, but completely legible. The date at the top, September 14th, 2000. The addressee Office of Undergraduate Admissions and Financial Aid, Columbia University. Dear members of the Scholarship Committee, I am writing on behalf of my son Ethan James Hayes, who has applied for the Merit Scholarship in your engineering program. I understand that letters of this kind are most effective when they are specific, so I will try to be specific. Ethan is not the easiest person to describe to strangers, because the qualities that matter most about him do not show up on a transcript. He is the kind of person who at 16 years old spent 3 Saturdays helping his neighbor, a man he barely knew, replace the rotted wood on a front porch, not because he was asked and not because he expected anything from it, but because he said it bothered him to see something broken that he knew how to fix. I stopped reading. My chest was doing something that was not quite pain and not quite grief, but contained both of them in equal measure, pressing upward from somewhere behind my sternum in a way that required me to sit very still and breathe carefully until it passed. Ethan had gotten that scholarship. He had called from the campus library to tell me, and his voice had carried the particular exhilaration of someone for whom a door has just opened that they had not entirely believed would open. I had sat in the kitchen that afternoon and felt the specific private pride that a parent feels when the thing they hoped for their child actually arrives. The pride that does not need to be announced because it is too large for announcement. He had never known about the letter. I had written it and sealed it and sent it and never mentioned it because it had seemed to me at the time that the letter was for him and not about me, and that telling him would have made it about me. I turned to the second page. Ethan is also the kind of person who remembers things, not facts, people. He remembers the names of the people who helped him, and he carries those names forward. I believe this is the most reliable indicator of character. I know not what a person does when circumstances are favorable, but what they carry with them when circumstances no longer require them to. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands. The man I had described in these 3 pages had been real. I had not invented him or embellished. I had described what I had seen because scholarship committees respond to specificity, and I had had specific things to say. The boy who spent 3 Saturdays fixing a stranger's porch. The boy who remembered names. That boy had become the man who saved my number under Old Man and let 14 calls go to voicemail. I did not know at which point one had become the other. I did not know whether it had happened gradually, the way a wire degrades inside a wall, invisible, incremental, dangerous, only when it finally fails, or whether there had been a specific moment, a single decision, a door through which he had walked, and behind which something essential had been left. I set the letter on the bed beside me and looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Thomas. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had not slept either. "I found Helen's box," I said. "The letter I wrote for Ethan's Columbia scholarship is inside it. 3 pages. I described who he was at 17. I stopped. "He never knew I wrote it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I am trying to figure out which version of grief this is," I said. "The kind where you lose someone, or the kind where you realize you lost them a long time ago and only just found out?" Thomas thought about that. "Probably both," he said. "At the same time." "Yes," I said. That is what I thought too." I looked at the letter on the bed, then at the empty space on the wall where the hallway photograph used to hang, then at the lamp with the cream shade that was still exactly right. "Thomas," I said, "tomorrow I want to start building something, not tearing down, building." "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need to know everything there is to know about that Midtown presentation," I said. "Every detail, every name on the guest list that we can find. And I need Elena." Thomas arrived at 8:15 the next morning with coffee and a paper bag from the bakery on 7th Avenue, and he found me sitting at the kitchen counter because there was no longer a table to sit at. He set everything down, looked at the empty space in the middle of the room where the dining table had been, and did not comment on it. He pulled 2 stools from under the counter and sat on one, and we ate in the kitchen the way men eat when the surrounding circumstances are too large to address before breakfast. After a while he said, "You said last night you wanted to tell me something that happened before you were discharged." "Yes," I said. I set my cup down. "There is a thing I have not told you yet, about the last afternoon in the hospital." Thomas opened his notebook and waited. I told him about Ethan's visit. I told it straight through the way I had rehearsed it in my head during the night. Not because I needed to rehearse the facts, but because some things require a certain amount of internal preparation before they can be spoken aloud without the voice breaking in places that would make them harder to hear. Ethan had arrived at 2 in the afternoon on the day before my discharge. I had not been expecting him. The door opened, and he was simply there, a bouquet of yellow tulips in one hand, his other hand already extended in the particular gesture of a man who has practiced the entrance. The blazer pressed the expression assembled into something that read as warm and concerned and slightly guilty in exactly the right proportions. He sat in the blue plastic chair, the chair that had been empty for 6 days. He asked about my heart rhythm, my medication, whether I was sleeping. He told me about a restaurant in Carroll Gardens he and Claire had tried the previous weekend, described the food in the kind of detail that suggested he was filling time rather than communicating. I listened and nodded, and said the things that were expected of me. And we sat together in that room for 20 minutes in a version of a father-son conversation that had the shape of the real thing without any of the substance. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. He placed a photograph on my bedside tray. The photograph of Helen and me from our wedding day, the one that had hung in our hallway for 22 years, the one that had been on that wall when I left for the hospital and was gone from that wall when I came home. He set it face up, turned so that it was oriented toward me, and he left his hand on the edge of the tray as he spoke. "Yad," he said. His voice dropped into a register that I recognized, the register he had used as a child when he wanted something and understood that the wanting needed to be packaged in a certain way to be received. I have been thinking about Mom a lot lately, about what she would want for this family. She always said she wanted us to be secure. She always talked about making sure things were taken care of before they needed to be. He reached into his briefcase and produced a document. Clean, professional, 4 pages stapled at the corner. He set it beside the photograph. "This is a financial power of attorney," he said. "It would allow me to act on your behalf in financial matters if you are ever in a position where you cannot act for yourself. It is a standard document, Dad. Most people our age put one in place. It is not about now. It is about being prepared. A financial power of attorney under New York law gives the designated agent broad authority to manage the grantor's bank accounts, investments, real estate, and financial decisions. It can be drafted to take effect immediately or only upon incapacity." The version Ethan had placed on my tray, I could see enough of the language from where I sat, appeared to take effect upon signing with no incapacity requirement. He had not explained that distinction. He had described it as standard. It was not standard. It was comprehensive and immediate, and it would have given him legal authority over every financial decision of my life from the moment I signed. I looked at the document. Then I looked at the photograph beside it. Helen in her wedding dress laughing at something just off camera. Her hand on my arm. The expression on her face that I had spent 38 years trying to be worthy of. Ethan had taken that photograph from my hallway wall. He had carried it to a hospital room. He had placed it beside a document designed to give him control of everything Helen and I had built together. And he had used her name, what she would want, what she always said, as the language of persuasion. My hand moved toward the pen on the tray. I watched my own hand move and understood in the same moment exactly what was happening and exactly what it would mean if I allowed it to continue. I stopped. "You know what your mother said to me the last morning she was well enough to have a real conversation?" I asked. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. "No," he said. "What did she say?" "She said, Richard, never sign anything you have not read yourself from the first word to the last." I picked up the document and held it in both hands. "I have not read this from the first word to the last, so I am going to need some time with it." Ethan's jaw tightened by 1 degree. He recovered quickly, the smile returned, the warmth was repositioned. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely. Take all the time you need." He stood, straightened his blazer, picked up his briefcase. "I will check in soon." He left the tulips. He left the photograph of his mother on my tray and walked out the door without taking it back. Thomas had been writing continuously. When I finished, he kept his pen on the page for a moment without lifting it. "He brought your wife's photograph to a hospital room," Thomas said, "and used it as a prop." "Yes," I said. "And he left it there when he left." "Yes." Thomas lifted his pen, set it down, picked it up again. "Richard," he said. "That tells us something important. It tells us he does not feel what we would feel in that situation." He thought about how to use that photograph. He planned it. And when it did not work, he left it behind because it had served its purpose, and he no longer needed it. I looked at my hands on the counter. "I know," I said. "That is the part that stayed with me through the night." Thomas turned to a new page. "All right," he said. "Then let us talk about how we use the next 3 weeks." Thomas had 3 pages of notes by the time Elena arrived at 10 o'clock. She came with Camille Porter, who carried a briefcase and moved through my front door with the efficient calm of someone who had walked into complicated situations before and had developed a method for them. Elena looked at the empty space in the middle of my living room, the floor where the dining table had been, and her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes registered it in a way that told me she understood immediately what she was looking at and what it meant. "We can work at the counter," I said. We spread everything across the kitchen counter. Thomas's notebook, Camille's documents, the printed timeline Thomas had drawn the previous morning, the wooden box, which I had brought from the bedroom because the letter inside it had become in my mind the fixed point of everything. The thing I kept coming back to when I needed to remember what was actually at stake. Elena spoke first. "The presentation is scheduled for Friday, March 14th, she said. "The Marriott Marquis, Midtown. Ballroom B. Ethan has sent formal invitations to 212 people, a mix of existing investors, prospective investors, business contacts, and what appear to be individuals invited primarily to create the impression of a large established network." She placed a printed copy of the invitation on the counter. At the bottom, in clean serif type, were 2 lines that made the muscles along my jaw tighten immediately, proudly supported by Richard J. Hayes, founding principal. "In partnership with Whitmore Foundation." "He printed that," I said. "He put that on a formal invitation and mailed it to 212 people." "Yes," Elena said. 3 weeks ago. Before you were hospitalized." Thomas looked up from his notebook. "Which means he had already committed to those words before you went into Lenox Hill. The hospitalization was not the cause of this. It was an opportunity he added to an existing plan." I set the invitation down and pushed it slightly away from me the way you push away something you need to keep looking at but cannot hold. Camille opened her briefcase and laid 3 documents on the counter in a row evenly spaced with the precision of someone who understood that how information was presented affected how clearly it was received. "3 things require your immediate attention," she said. Her voice was direct and unhurried, the voice of a woman who dealt in facts and found them sufficient. "First, the will. The document Jennifer Lowe prepared is not legally enforceable as written. A non-attorney preparing a legal document under false pretenses combined with documented misrepresentation of the document's contents to the signatory creates grounds to have it voided entirely. Elena's attorney has already drafted a formal challenge. What we need from you is a new will prepared by a licensed estate attorney, signed in proper form with legitimate witnesses." She looked at me. "We can have someone here by this afternoon if you are ready." "I am ready," I said. "Second, your accounts." Camille moved to the middle document. "We have reason to believe notification settings on your Chase and Fidelity accounts were altered without your authorization. Voicemails and email alerts have been redirected. Marcus Webb left 3 messages over 2 weeks that you never received. We need you to change every password, every security question, every notification email address today, before this meeting ends." I thought about Webb's 3 calls going to voicemail while I sat in room 318 looking at an empty chair. I thought about Ethan in his pressed blazer knowing exactly which calls were coming and exactly where they were going. "Done," I said. "Walk me through it." Third. Camille moved to the last document. This one she picked up and held rather than leaving it on the counter, which told me before she spoke that this was the one she had weighed most carefully before deciding how to present it. Ethan is expecting to walk into that ballroom on March 14th with your implicit endorsement and ours. He has built his entire presentation around those two associations. Without them, the structure of what he has constructed collapses. So we remove them, I said. Publicly. We remove them publicly, Elena confirmed, and we replace them with the truth. She looked at me with the steady, direct gaze I had come to recognize as her default mode of communication. No softening, no decoration, just the thing she actually meant. My father spent 23 years trying to find the man who carried him out of a burning stairwell. He kept a photograph in his desk and a phone number in an envelope, and he did not stop believing the man was out there. She paused. Ethan has been telling investors that the Hayes name represents credibility earned over 40 years. He is correct about that. He is simply wrong about who gets to carry it into that room. Thomas looked up at me from the counter. Are you certain about this? His voice had dropped into something quieter than his usual register. The voice he used when he was asking something he actually needed the answer to, not just confirming what he already believed. I looked at the counter, the invitation with my name on it, the documents Camille had laid out, the wooden box with its 3 pages of faded handwriting. I looked at the 4 marks in the carpet visible through the kitchen doorway where the table had stood. I looked at the cream lampshade in the bedroom doorway, the one thing in this house that was exactly where Helen had put it, and exactly as she had left it. In electrical work, I said, when a circuit has been running a fault for a long time, the instinct is to isolate the problem section and patch it. Replace the damaged wire, restore the connection, move on. I picked up the invitation. But sometimes the fault has been running long enough that isolation is not enough. Sometimes you have to trace it all the way back to the source and let people see exactly where it started and exactly what it has been doing inside the wall. I set the invitation down. That is what we are going to do on March 14th. Camille made a note. Elena nodded once, the short, definitive nod of a woman who had made a decision some time ago and was simply waiting for the other people in the room to arrive at the same place. Thomas wrote 2 words in his notebook, underlined them both, and turned the page to begin the list of everything that needed to happen between today and the 14th. Outside, the February light was thinning toward noon, and somewhere on the block, a dog was barking at something it could smell but not see. And the maple tree in the front yard stood bare and patient against the pale sky, exactly where Helen had put it, waiting for the season to change. The estate attorney left at 4:30 in the afternoon. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she had arrived at 2 o'clock with a leather satchel and the brisk, unshowy competence of a woman who had been preparing wills in New York for 27 years and had stopped finding them remarkable. She sat with me at the kitchen counter for 90 minutes, went through every asset in careful order: the house, the Chase accounts, the Fidelity Retirement Fund, the life insurance policy, the small savings account I had maintained separately since the year Ethan started college, and she prepared a new will that said exactly what I intended it to say, witnessed by Thomas and Camille Porter, notarized on the spot. The previous document, the one Jennifer Lowe had prepared under Claire's direction, was formally revoked in writing. When Margaret Holloway left, she shook my hand at the door and said without sentiment, but with the particular gravity of someone who means what they say, "This document reflects your actual wishes. That is what a will is supposed to do." After she was gone, Thomas stayed for another hour going through the account security changes, with me new passwords, new security questions, new notification, email addresses on every account, the voicemail settings restored to their original configuration. By 5:30, Every door that had been quietly opened without my knowledge was closed and locked from the inside. Thomas left at 6. I was alone in the house by 6:15, and the quiet that settled in after the door closed was different from the quiet of the previous night. It was not the quiet of a man sitting with damage. It was the quiet of a man who has spent the day doing what needed to be done, and now has the evening for whatever the evening requires. I went to the bedroom and took the wooden box from the nightstand. I had looked at the letter last night, the scholarship letter, the 3 pages of my own handwriting, describing a boy I had loved and believed in. Tonight I looked at the other things in the box. The notes in Helen's handwriting, the small folded cards, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a stack of papers held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age, letters, in a child's handwriting. 8 of them written across several years, the earliest in the crooked, effortful print of a 6-year-old, and the latest in the more confident cursive of a boy of perhaps 11 or 12. Helen had kept everyone. I read them in order. The third one stopped me. "Dear Mom, today, Dad took me to the building he is working on. He let me wear his hard hat. It was too big and kept falling over my eyes. Dad laughed and said I would grow into it. I want to work with Dad when I grow up. I want to build things that stay. I want to build things that stay." I set the letter down on the bed and pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and held it there for a moment. Then I picked up the next letter and kept reading, because the only way through a thing like this is through it. By the time I had read all 8, the room had gone fully dark outside the window. I put the letters back in careful order, replaced the rubber band, and set the box on the nightstand. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself remember the Christmas I had been not allowing myself to remember since the night I lay in room 318 looking at the ceiling. December 25th, 2024. I had started preparing 4 days before. Helen used to say that Christmas dinner was not about the food. It was about the accumulated intention, the care that went into every step, the choosing and the preparing and the setting of the table, and that the people who ate it could always taste the difference between food made with attention and food made to fill a space. I had made her pot roast recipe, the one she had written on an index card in her precise handwriting, and kept in the recipe box on the counter that Claire had apparently not considered worth taking. I had set the table for 4 myself, Ethan, Claire, and the empty chair I still set for Helen at holidays, because it was not a delusion, it was a choice, and it was mine to make. At 10:14 in the morning, my phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text message from Ethan. Not a call. A text. "Hey Dad, change of plans on our end. Hope you have a good one. Merry Christmas." 9 words, no explanation, no suggestion of another time. No acknowledgement that I had told him 2 weeks earlier what I was planning to cook, or that he had said in the easy, uncommitted way he had developed for such conversations. "Yeah, that sounds great, Dad. We will be there." I had stood in the kitchen with the pot roast in the oven and the table set for 4, and read those 9 words 3 times. Then I had put my phone face down on the counter and finished cooking. I had eaten alone at a table set for 4 people in a house that smelled of Helen's recipe, and the pine wreath on the front door that I had hung, because Helen always hung one, and I saw no reason to stop. I had eaten slowly and deliberately, the way Helen had always said food deserved to be eaten. I had washed the dishes afterward. I had put the leftovers in containers in the refrigerator. I had not cried. I had not called Thomas. I had not allowed myself to examine what the 9 words actually meant, because on Christmas night, in a house that smelled like the best version of your life, some truths are better left until morning. Now it was morning. Or close enough. I looked at the wooden box on the nightstand. I thought about the boy who wanted to build things that stay. I thought about 9 words on a phone screen. I thought about the 4 marks in the carpet downstairs and the empty nail in the hallway wall. My phone rang. I did not recognize the number. I answered anyway because I had learned recently that the calls worth taking are not always the ones you expect. A woman's voice. Young, careful with the particular tension of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is hoping the rehearsal was sufficient. Mr. Hayes, my name is Jennifer Lowe. I prepared some documents for your family last March. A pause. I think you should know that I was not told the truth about what I was preparing. And I think... Her voice caught once pulled back. I think I owe you an explanation. If you are willing to hear it. Jennifer Lowe's voice steadied as she talked the way a person's voice steadies when they have been carrying something alone for long enough that the relief of finally setting it down outweighs the fear of what happens next. She had been a bookkeeper for 11 years. She handled accounts for small businesses in Brooklyn and Queens, payroll, quarterly taxes, basic financial record-keeping. She was not a paralegal. She was not a licensed attorney. She had no formal training in estate law or document preparation. When Claire had called her last March, Claire had described the task as a simple administrative update to an existing will formatting adjustments. She had said nothing substantive, just tidying the language so it was easier to read. She told me you had already reviewed everything and agreed to the changes, Jennifer said. She told me this was just the clerical part. I believed her because she stopped. Because she is a convincing person and because I did not ask the questions I should have asked. What did you add to the document? I asked. Is a clause in Section 4, Jennifer said. It established that in the event you were determined to be unable to manage your own financial affairs, either by a physician's assessment or by the judgment of 2 family members acting in agreement, authority over your accounts and property would transfer temporarily to Ethan Hayes as designated administrator. She spoke carefully, as though she had rehearsed the legal language specifically so she could deliver it accurately. I was told it was standard protective language. I did not know it was not standard. I did not know that a clause like that in a document prepared by someone without a law license under those circumstances was... She stopped again. Wrong. I did not know it was wrong. You know now, I said. I know now, she said. And I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry, Mr. Hayes. I thanked her and told her Elena's attorney would be in contact the following morning. She said she would cooperate fully. She said she had already written everything down in case she needed to provide a formal account. I believed her not because she owed me anything, but because the particular quality of her distress on the phone was the distress of a person who had been used and knew it and was doing the only thing available to her to correct it. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen counter in the dark for a few minutes without turning the lights on. Then I called Thomas. He arrived 20 minutes later with Elena, who had apparently already been on her way before I called, because Camille had been monitoring the situation, and Elena had learned over the course of her professional life to be in motion before the moment required it. Elena placed a folder on the counter without preamble. Marcus Webb forwarded this 2 hours ago, she said. He found it in a shared drive Ethan had given him access to 14 months ago for project documents. Ethan apparently forgot it was still accessible. She opened the folder. Read the title page first. The document was 12 pages printed on plain paper, spiral-bound. The title, centered at the top of the first page in ordinary 12-point type, read, Hayes Asset Transition Strategic Planning Document. Confidential. I opened to the first tabbed section. It was labeled Option A. Option A described a scenario in which I signed a voluntary transfer of financial management authority. It included a timeline 6 months from initiation to completion, and a projected outcome column that listed in order the Brooklyn House, the Chase checking and savings accounts, the Fidelity Retirement Fund, the life insurance policy. Beside each asset was a current estimated value. The house, $890,000. The retirement accounts, $640,000. The life insurance, $280,000. Total $1,810,000. At the bottom of the page, in a notes column, preferred scenario. Cleanest transfer, requires cooperation. I turned to the second tab. Option B. Option B described the guardianship petition route, the filing, the 90-day review period, the suspension of my ability to execute financial documents. The notes column read, viable if option A fails. Slower. Risk of legal challenge, mitigate with hospital documentation and behavioral record. I set the page down and took one slow breath. Then I turned to the third tab. Option C, natural timeline. The page was structured as a simple table. Left column, asset category. Center column, current estimated value. Right column, a heading that read, projected transfer mechanism. Under projected transfer mechanism, beside every asset, were 3 words, estate distribution. Beneficiaries, E. Hayes, C. Hayes. At the bottom of the table in the notes section, Ethan had written in the same plain formatting as everything else on the page, as though it were an ordinary business observation. Subject, cardiac history, documented arrhythmia. Conservative natural timeline, estimate 3 to 7 years. Recommend maintaining option A and option B in parallel to avoid sole dependence on option C. 3 to 7 years. He had written those words about me, about my heart, about the time he estimated remained before the problem resolved itself, without requiring any action from him at all. I put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the document and breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth 4 times, the way Dr. Marsh had shown me, the way I had been using all week to bring an irregular rhythm back toward something the body can maintain. Thomas stood across the counter from me and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the document was not already saying with complete clarity. Elena stood to my left, watching me with the steady, careful attention of someone who has delivered this kind of information before and understands that the most useful thing you can offer in the moments after is simply your presence. He gave it a tab, I said. My voice came out level and quiet. He put it in a spiral-bound document with a title page and a notes column, and he gave my death its own tab. Yes, Elena said. I looked at the notes column again. Cardiac history, 3 to 7 years. I thought about the morning in 1995 when I had gone back up a stairwell because I heard the man shouting and I could not make myself walk away. I thought about the 40 years of work that had followed that morning, the buildings, the apprentices, the reputation, built one honest job at a time. I thought about Helen choosing the dining table, the ceramic rooster, the cream lampshade. I thought about the letter I had written for a 17-year-old boy who wanted to build things that stay. All right, I said. I closed the document and set it aside and looked at Thomas. 3 weeks, I said. Let us make sure every person in that ballroom on March 14th understands exactly what they have been invited to be part of. Thomas picked up his pen. Elena opened her phone. And in the kitchen of a house that had been partially emptied while its owner was in a hospital bed, 3 people began building something that could not be taken, sold, or erased. I slept that night. Not well and not long, but I slept, which was more than I had managed in the previous 3 nights combined, and which told me something about what happens to a man's nervous system when he stops waiting for the next thing to land and starts deciding where he is going to stand when it does. I was up at 5:30. I made coffee in the kitchen, standing at the counter because there was still no table, and I looked out the window at the backyard in the February dark, the bare garden beds where Helen used to grow tomatoes every summer, the wooden fence that needed repainting, the maple tree in the front yard, visible at the corner of the window branches, black against a sky that had not yet decided what color it intended to be. Thomas arrived at 7 with his notebook and a box of donuts from the shop on Fifth Avenue, which was his way of signaling that a morning was going to be long and required fortification. Elena joined by phone at 7:30, her voice carrying the crisp, ready quality of someone already several steps into her day. We talked for 2 hours. The conversation covered ground I had already begun mapping in my head during the dark, early morning hours, the specific mechanics of what we intended to do on March 14th, who needed to be where, what needed to be said, and in what order what documents needed to be visible, and at what moment. Camille had already begun coordinating with the hotel's audio-visual team through a third party. Marcus Webb had confirmed he would attend and would speak if asked. Jennifer Lowe had submitted her written account to Elena's attorney before 9 in the morning, which was faster than any of us had expected, and which told me that the act of making the call the previous night had been a relief to her, and she had not wanted to lose the momentum of it. By the time Elena ended the call, the outline of what would happen on March 14th was clear enough that I could see its shape, the way I used to see the shape of a wiring diagram before I began, not every detail resolved, but the logic of it, sound the path from source to completion, visible and followable. "There is one thing we have not talked about," Thomas said when Elena's line had gone quiet. "I know," I said. "You have to keep answering his calls the same way you have been answering them. For 3 more weeks. Every time he calls, you are tired, you are grateful he checked in, you are not asking questions." Thomas looked at me steadily across the counter. "If he senses anything has changed, he moves faster. He files the guardianship petition early, he accelerates whatever else he has in motion, and we lose the element of surprise." "I understand," I said. "Can you do it 3 more weeks of that?" I thought about the phone call 9 days ago. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Ethan's voice warm and unhurried, asking how I was feeling while the chair beside my bed had been empty for 2 days already. I thought about how natural it had felt to say I was fine, I was managing, don't worry about me. I thought about how many years I had been practicing that particular performance without knowing it was a performance. "I have been doing it for longer than 3 weeks," I said. "I know the part." Thomas nodded and wrote something down. At 4:17 that afternoon, Ethan called. I looked at the screen. I set down the glass of water I was holding. I pressed my back teeth together once lightly and released. Then I pressed accept and put the phone to my ear. "Hey, son." "Dad." The warmth arrived immediately, fully formed the way warmth arrives when it has been prepared in advance. "Just checking in. How are you feeling? You getting some rest?" "Better," I said. "Slept pretty well last night, actually. First time in a while." "That's great. Dad, that's really good to hear." A brief pause, the pause of a man performing mild concern. "You eating okay? You need anything sent over?" "I'm fine. Mrs. Mills from across the street brought over a casserole yesterday. I've got enough food to last a week." "Good, good." Another pause, slightly longer. "Listen, I wanted to ask, I know you met with Elena Whitmore at the hospital. I heard through some contacts that she had reached out." His voice remained easy, conversational, the voice of a man mentioning something he had noticed, without wanting to suggest it mattered. "I just wanted to say those are sophisticated people, Dad. High level. I wouldn't want anyone taking advantage of your situation while you're still recovering. You know how these things can go." I let a moment pass before I answered. not long enough to suggest hesitation, just long enough to suggest an older man gathering his thoughts. "She was very kind," I said. "She came to say thank you about something that happened a long time ago. Her family and mine apparently have some history going back 30 years. I let my voice carry the mild, uncomplicated pleasure of someone recounting a pleasant surprise. "Lovely woman. Very thoughtful. Of course." Ethan's tone adjusted slightly, recalibrating the way a system recalibrates when a reading comes back different from expected, but not different enough to trigger an alarm. "That is nice, Dad. I'm glad she came." A beat. "Did she mention anything about business? Any kind of professional conversation?" "We talked about her father mostly," I said. "And about getting old. You know how those conversations go." A short laugh from Ethan, genuine enough on the surface, calibrated underneath. Yeah, I know." Another pause. "All right, Dad. You take care of yourself. I'll call later in the week." "Thank you for checking in, son." The call ended. I set the phone on the counter and stood with both hands braced against the edge of the surface, looking at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was going amber over the rooftops. The long winter light that arrives in February without warmth, but with a particular clarity that makes every outline sharp. Thomas had been sitting at the counter the entire time, not writing, just listening. When I set the phone down, he looked at me. "Well," he said. "He knows Elena came," I said. "He has contacts at the hospital, or someone told him. He is not alarmed, yet the reading came back close enough to normal that he adjusted and moved on." I straightened up from the counter. "But he is watching now. He will watch more carefully from here." "Then we give him nothing to see," Thomas said. "That is exactly right," I said. "In electrical work, when you are tracing a fault, you do not announce yourself. You follow the current quietly. You let the system keep running exactly as it has been running. And you wait until you are standing at the right point in the circuit before you cut the power." Thomas looked at me for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote that down, word for word. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, I said. The days between the 9th and the 14th of February had a particular quality that I had not experienced before, the quality of time that is moving towards something while appearing to stand still. I answered Ethan's calls. I said I was feeling better, said the rest was helping, said I was taking my medication on schedule and eating properly. I said nothing that was untrue and nothing that was useful to him. I had always believed that the most disciplined form of honesty was knowing precisely which truths to offer and which to hold in reserve, and these 2 weeks were teaching me that I was better at it than I had given myself credit for. Thomas came by most mornings. Elena called every other day, brief focused calls, each one covering a specific piece of the preparation and ending when that piece was covered. Camille had secured secondary access to the hotel's presentation system through the audio-visual coordinator, a detail she relayed to Thomas in a text message of 4 words. System access confirmed. Ready. Thomas showed me the message, and I thought about what those 4 words represented. The quiet, careful work of people who understood that the most important preparations are the ones the other side never sees coming. On the morning of February 14th, Thomas called at 7:45. "Pull up whatever you use for social media," he said. "Search your own name." I did not use social media in any regular way. Helen had shown me Facebook in 2012, and I had concluded within 2 weeks that it was designed for a kind of attention I did not have. I opened it now, typed my name into the search bar, and found what Thomas had already found: a video. Posted 3 days ago from an account created 4 days ago. No profile photograph. No friends, no other posts. The account name was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing. The video was 47 seconds long. I pressed play. The footage was shot from inside my living room. I recognized the wall, the window, the angle of the afternoon light. The camera was low and slightly tilted, the perspective of a phone placed horizontally on a surface pointing across the room. It had been sitting on the end table beside the couch. I remembered that table. I remembered Ethan sitting on the couch during his visit 2 weeks before my hospitalization, the visit where he had talked about the future and planning and what a responsible man does for his family. And I remembered that at some point during that conversation, he had set his phone on that table face down. Face down. Screen facing the table. Camera facing the room. On the screen, I was standing in the center of my living room with my arm extended pointing toward the front door, and I was shouting. I watched myself. The angle caught me from the side jaw, set face red voice loud enough that it distorted slightly through the small phone speaker. I looked to a person who did not know what had preceded that moment, exactly like a man who had lost control of himself. The clip ended there. 47 seconds. The caption beneath it read, "Worried about a family member. Has anyone else dealt with something like this with an aging parent looking for advice?" The comments were already in the hundreds. This is so hard to watch. My dad went through something similar. Poor guy. Caregiver burnout is real. Someone should check on this man. He doesn't seem safe. My grandfather acted like this right before his diagnosis. Please get him evaluated. I closed the application and set the phone down on the counter. He had sat on the couch and talked about the future in his reasonable voice, and at a certain point he had said, "Dad, you are getting older. There are going to come a time when you cannot manage things the way you have been managing them. It would be better for everyone if you started thinking about a transition plan now, while you are still sharp enough to make the decisions yourself." I had told him I was 62 years old in functional health, and that I would manage my own affairs for as long as I was alive to manage them. He had nodded slowly, as though considering my position. Then he had said, "I just think Emily would have wanted." He had stopped himself, corrected. The name said Helen. "I just think Helen would have wanted things to be more settled." That was the moment. The moment he used her name as a lever, and I felt the floor shift and the anger come up through my chest and into my throat and out of my mouth at a volume I had not intended. "Get out of my house." The clip started at those words. Everything before them gone. Thomas arrived at 8:30. He sat across the counter and looked at me with the expression of a man delivering information he has already organized into the correct order. "The account was created the day after Ethan's visit to your house," Thomas said. "Dorothy Mills saw his car outside that afternoon. He was inside for 45 minutes. He paused. "The phone was on the end table the entire visit. I remembered you mentioning it when you described the conversation to me. He placed it there when he arrived and picked it up when he left." "He planned it before he walked through the door," I said. "Yes. He came to that conversation knowing he was going to make you angry. The language about Helen that was not a slip. He chose it because he knew what it would do." Thomas folded his hands on the counter. "Richard. He rehearsed this." I looked at the counter surface, the wood grain running in a direction I had never particularly noticed before, parallel lines that did not intersect regardless of how far they extended. "The comments," I said. 200 people are going to walk into that ballroom in 4 weeks having seen that clip. They are going to look at me and see what the clip showed them." "Some of them," Thomas said. "Yes." Then we may make sure they also see what the clip did not show them. I picked up my phone. I want to call Elena. I want the full recording, everything Ethan said before the camera started. Dorothy heard him arrive. Did she hear anything through the window? Thomas was already reaching for his notebook. She did, he said. I did not mention it before because I was waiting until we knew what we were dealing with. He found the page. She heard two things clearly. The first, he said, your name is going to be worth nothing in 5 years if you keep refusing to be strategic about it. He looked up. The second, and she is certain about this, because she was standing at her mailbox and the window was open, he said, that old men who cannot adapt become obstacles and obstacles get moved. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. She will say that, I said. On the record. In front of whoever needs to hear it. She already agreed, Thomas said. Last night, she said, and I am quoting her directly. Tell Richard I have been waiting for someone to ask. The days had a rhythm now. And rhythm is what a man reaches for when the ground beneath him has been unreliable. Morning coffee at the counter. Thomas most days, sometimes not. Elena every other afternoon by phone, covering the specific logistics of what was being built toward March 14th, with the methodical precision of a woman who understood that the difference between a plan that works and one that does not is almost always in the details nobody thought to check. Camille sent updates through Thomas' short, factual messages about confirmations received, positions secured, pieces moved into place. Marcus Webb called once to ask if there was anything further he could provide. I told him his presence on March 14th was sufficient, and he said he would be there. And I believed him the way you believe a man who has already shown you the quality of his word under pressure. Ethan called every 3 or 4 days. The calls were brief and followed the same structure, warm, opening, mild inquiry about my health. A story about something happening with the business that was going well, a closing that included the word Dad delivered, with the particular emphasis of a man using a title he understands the strategic value of. I answered the same way each time. Tired, but improving. Not much news. Take care of yourself, son. I became very good at those calls, better than I wanted to be. On the 19th of February, Ethan came to the house. He called ahead this time 30 minutes notice, which was more courtesy than he had shown on the visit 8 weeks ago. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a dark coat, carrying a paper bag from a sandwich shop on Montague Street, and he stood at the front door with the easy proprietorial comfort of a man who has always expected to be let in. I let him in. We sat at the counter. There was still no dining table, and if Ethan noticed the absence, he chose not to mention it, which told me something about how carefully he had decided not to see things that did not serve his current narrative. I put the sandwiches on plates. I poured 2 glasses of water. We ate like 2 people who had agreed without discussing it to behave as though everything was ordinary. You look better, Ethan said. Color's back. Rest helps, I said. You should take more of it. He picked up his sandwich, set it back down, looked around the kitchen with the slow, assessing gaze of a man pricing a property he intends to acquire. His eyes moved across the counters, the cabinets, the window above the sink where the ceramic rooster no longer sat. The house looks different, he said. Did you move some things around? Just simplifying, I said. Less to keep track of. He nodded, and the nod carried a small, contained satisfaction that he did not quite manage to keep off his face before it passed. That makes sense, he said. At a certain point, you realize you don't need as much around you. I drank my water and looked at him across the counter. He was 35 years old. He had my jaw and Helen's eyes and the particular set of his shoulders that I recognized from photographs of my own father, who had died before Ethan was born. and whom Ethan had therefore never known, but had somehow inherited the posture of anyway. He was a handsome man in an expensive coat eating a sandwich in his father's kitchen, and he had a spreadsheet at home with a tab for when his father's heart gave out. I thought about the letter. 3 pages. I want to work with Dad when I grow up. I want to build things that stay. Dad. Ethan set his sandwich down and looked at me with the expression he used when he was about to say something he had prepared. I know things have been difficult lately. The hospitalization, recovering at home alone, that's a lot for one person. He paused. I've been thinking about whether you should consider something more, I don't know, structured, in terms of your living situation. Not now, not immediately, but something to think about. I looked at him steadily. What kind of structured situation? Just options. There are some really good communities now, Dad. Not like the old days. Modern, active people your age, medical support on site. He kept his voice reasonable, the voice of a man proposing something sensible. Claire and I have actually looked at a few just to have information. Nothing definitive, just so we'd know what was available. I set my glass down. They had looked at facilities. While I was in the hospital, while Claire was arranging for my dining table to be carried out of my house, Ethan had been looking at places to put me. I appreciate you thinking about it, I said. My voice came out with the mild, slightly fatigued quality I had been practicing. Let me get a bit more strength back first. Then maybe we can talk about options. Ethan's expression softened into something that wanted to be mistaken for relief. Of course, he said. No rush. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. He left at 3:30. He hugged me at the door, one arm around my shoulders, a brief, firm pressure, the hug of a man executing a gesture he has decided is appropriate. I put my hand on his back, the way I always had, the right number of times, the right amount of pressure. He walked down the front path to his car. He did not look back. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The empty nail was still in the wall where the photograph had been. I looked at it, and then I walked to the kitchen and called Thomas. He has been looking at facilities, I said, while I was in the hospital. He and Claire looked at communities' senior living medical support on site. Thomas was quiet for 3 seconds. He was moving on all 3 options simultaneously, he said. Option A, Option B, and preparing Option C's environment in advance. Yes, I said. That is what he was doing. How are you? I looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree, bare branches, gray sky, the tree Helen had carried home in the back of a station wagon because she said a yard needed something that would outlast both of them. I took the suit out of the closet at 7 in the evening. It was 12 years old. I had bought it for a colleague's retirement dinner in 2013, a dark charcoal wool, well-made, the kind of suit that had been expensive enough when new to still be worth wearing now. I had worn it twice since then, once to a funeral, once to a dinner where I had been asked to say a few words about a building project I had worked on 30 years earlier, a project that had meant something to the people in the room. Both times the suit had done what a suit is supposed to do. It had allowed the occasion to be about something other than what I was wearing. I put it on and stood in front of the mirror on the back of the bedroom door. 62 years old. Gray at the temples and at the edges of everything. The suit still fit across the shoulders, which Helen had always said were the only measurement that mattered in a jacket. Get the shoulders right, and a tailor can fix anything else. I had not needed a tailor. The shoulders were exactly where they had always been. I looked at myself for a long moment, not with vanity and not with self-criticism, with the particular attention of a man who is about to walk into a room full of people and needs to know exactly who is walking in with him. I took the suit off, folded it over the chair beside the bed, and drove to Greenwood Cemetery. The gates were still open. Greenwood kept evening hours in the warmer months, and March in Brooklyn was not yet warm, but it was no longer the hard cold of February. Either the air had that particular quality of very early spring when the temperature has not yet committed to anything, but the quality of the light has changed, as though the sky has quietly made a decision the ground has not yet been told about. Helen's section was in the older part of the cemetery, under a row of oak trees that in summer made a canopy over the path, and in winter stood bare and legible against the sky, their branches making the same pattern they had always made, patient and unchanged. I stood in front of her headstone, her name, her dates, and below them a line she had chosen herself years before she needed it. She had told me one evening, without particular drama, that she had decided what she wanted it to say. And she had told me because she wanted to make sure it was right and not left to my discretion, which she said with the particular affection of a woman who knew exactly what her husband's discretion was capable of producing unsupervised. The line read, "She made room for everyone." I had not brought flowers. Helen had always said cut flowers were a transaction, something given to make the giver feel better, rather than to serve the receiver, and that if a person wanted to honor someone, they should do something that cost them more than money. I had brought nothing. I had brought myself, which was, I thought, probably enough. "Tomorrow," I said. My voice in the open air of the cemetery had a different quality than my voice indoors, smaller, more honest, stripped of the acoustics that make a room feel inhabited. Hasano. Tomorrow I am going to walk into a room full of people who have been told a story about me. Some of them will have seen the clip. Some of them will have heard Ethan's version of who I am. A man whose best years are behind him, whose judgment cannot be trusted, who needs to be managed for his own good. I put my hands in my coat pockets. I am going to let them see the actual version. The oak trees were very still. Somewhere in the cemetery far away, a car door closed. "I have been thinking about what you would say if you were here," I said. "You would say, Rich, you have never needed a room full of people to tell you who you are." And you would be right. You were almost always right, which was not always easy to live with. But I want you to know I understood it was a gift even when it did not feel like one. I stopped. A wind moved through the oak branches above me, a brief and directionless wind that stirred the air and was gone. "He used your name," I said. "Ethan used your name to try to get me to sign papers that would have handed him everything we built together. He sat in a hospital room, and he put your photograph on the tray, and he said you would have wanted this." My hands tightened in my coat pockets. "I need you to know that I did not sign. And I need you to know that tomorrow I am going to make sure the people he borrowed my name for understand exactly what it actually represents." I stood for a while longer. The light was going completely now, the sky shifting from pale gray to the dark blue that arrives just before full dark, and the headstone was becoming harder to read in the fading light. But I did not need to read it. I had the words memorized. I had memorized them the day they were cut into the stone, and I had not lost a single one in 3 years. She made room for everyone. I drove home and sat at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and called Thomas at 9:15. He answered on the first ring. "Everything is in place," he said before I had asked. "Camille confirmed the system access an hour ago. Marcus is confirmed. Dorothy has her statement written out and memorized. She said she has said it to herself so many times in the mirror that she could deliver it in her sleep." A pause. "Elena called at 8. She said to tell you tomorrow we carry your father home." I held the phone against my ear and looked at the window above the kitchen sink, the windowsill where the ceramic rooster had stood for 17 years, the empty ledge of it, the particular shape of the absence. "Tell her thank you," I said. She also said one more thing, Thomas said. She said, wear the good suit. I looked at the suit folded over the chair in the bedroom doorway. The charcoal wool, the shoulders exactly right, 12 years old and still worth wearing. Tell her it's already out, I said. Thomas said goodnight. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and set it upside down on the dish rack, the way Helen had always set glasses upside down so they drain clean. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I did not sleep for a long time. But when sleep finally came, it was the sleep of a man who has done everything that can be done in advance and has placed the rest in the hands of the morning, which is the only place it can go anyway, and which is, if you are honest about it, where everything has always lived. Before I reveal the shocking confrontation inside that ballroom and how this betrayal was exposed in front of 200 people, drop a justice or the number 100 in the comments below. So I know you're still standing with me. Also a quick note. What follows contains dramatized fictional elements. If this isn't for you, feel free to close the video now. But if you're ready for the truth, let's continue. The Marriott Marquis Ballroom held 216 people that evening, and every one of them was looking at the stage when we walked in. Thomas held the door. Elena walked through first, and the particular quality of her presence in a room, the way space rearranged itself slightly around her without her asking it to, meant that several people turned before she had taken 3 steps. I followed her, and Thomas came through last and let the door close behind us without a sound. The room was warm and amber-lit round tables with white linen, the low sound of a presentation already in progress. On the stage at the far end, beneath a projection screen 12 feet wide, Ethan stood at the podium in a navy suit that fit him perfectly, speaking in the voice he used when he wanted a room to trust him. Measured, confident, the voice of a man who has prepared and knows it. On the screen behind him in large, clean letters, proudly supported by Richard J. Hayes, in partnership with Whitmore Foundation, my name. 12 feet tall, in a room I had never agreed to enter. Ethan saw Elena first. Something shifted in his face, a recalibration fast and nearly invisible, the adjustment of a system receiving an unexpected reading. Then his eyes moved past her. He found me. The room was already turning. 200 people following the direction of the presenter's eyes, rotating in their chairs, finding the door. I walked the full length of that ballroom in the 12-year-old charcoal suit, with the shoulders exactly right. And I did not hurry, and I did not look away from my son. And when I reached the foot of the stage, I stopped and looked up at him and said in a voice that did not require a microphone to reach every corner of the room, "Son, you said my name up there. I'd like to know when you asked me if that was all right." Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Elena stepped forward and addressed the room in the voice she used when she wanted to be heard, without raising it. She confirmed that Whitmore Foundation had no partnership with Ethan Hayes. She confirmed that Richard Hayes had authorized nothing. Marcus Webb stood from a center table and told 200 people that the name he had been sold was borrowed without permission from a man he had never been allowed to speak to directly. Camille activated the presentation system from her phone. The screen behind Ethan changed. The Hayes asset transition document filled 12 feet of wall. Option A. Option B. Option C, natural timeline. Cardiac history. 3 to 7 years. The room made a sound I had never heard before. Not a gasp. Something quieter and more permanent than a gasp, the sound of 200 people understanding something simultaneously and not knowing where to put it. Claire stood from a table to my left. I had not known she was there. She looked at Ethan once, not with grief, not with loyalty, and walked out the side door without speaking. The door closed behind her with a sound no louder than a breath. Ethan stood alone on the stage. He looked at me, just looked The calculation gone, the warmth gone, nothing left but a 35-year-old man standing in a navy suit in a room that had turned completely against him, looking at his father. I looked back at him for a long moment. Then I turned and walked out. 2 weeks later, Pastor Joe Whitfield shook my hand outside the community church on a Sunday morning in March and said, "Richard, it's been too long." "It has," I said. Thomas was beside me. The maple tree in my front yard had begun showing the first small buds of spring. The chair at my kitchen counter, the one that had been empty for too long, was not empty anymore. Some circuits once broken are rebuilt better than they were before. I spent too many years calling silence patience. Too many years looking at an empty chair and telling myself, it was fine, that family is complicated, that people get busy, that love shows up eventually if you wait long enough. I was wrong, and I paid for that mistake with 5 days alone in a hospital bed, counting minutes on a phone call that lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Don't make my mistake. Pay attention early. The people who love you will find the chair. The ones who love what you own will find the paperwork. This is what family justice looks like from the inside, not dramatic, not sudden. It arrives quietly in signed documents and unanswered calls, and a dining table carried out while you're still breathing. I believe God puts the right-wrong number in front of you at exactly the right moment. A call I was ashamed of became the call that gave me everything back. That is not coincidence. That is something larger than coincidence. My personal opinion, revenge dad energy is not about anger. It's about refusing to let someone erase you while you're still standing. It's about walking into a room in a 12-year-old suit and saying, "I am still here. And this is still my name." If this story of family justice reached something in, you leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Dad Returns, because more are coming. Thank you truly for staying until the very end. This story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection and meaningful storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you better. But if you stayed this long, you already know why.